welcome everybody, and thank you very much for coming along. If any of you were sitting in the room thinking, look, I've come along really because I'm not quite sure what this EDUQAS is, let me explain first of all. It's the English brand of WJEC, and that may be old news to some of you, and some of you may be familiar with that already. But you may be aware of the fact that there are now different approval processes for qualifications in England and Wales. And WJEC retains its badge, its label, its nomenclature, if you like, in terms of specifications in Wales for both GCSE and A-level. So if you are a Welsh geography teacher teaching in Wales, or an English geography teacher but teaching in Wales, then WJEC will remain your examination board. If you're an English teacher teaching in England, or a Welsh teacher teaching in England, but the key point is that you're teaching in England, then EDUQAS will become your name. And Andy Owen is the subject officer for GCSE geography. He's down over here, and I know Andy's going to say a couple of words at the end of this talk. The title, Supporting Students in the Decision-Making Process. When Andy and I were talking about what this lecture might focus upon for this year, there are many teachers who might be sitting here thinking, well, isn't the DME just something that students do? For instance, if you do EDUQAS, what's currently WJEC Spec B at GCSE, you'll know that if there's an examination paper, paper 2, that students do, perhaps you're an EdXL B geography teacher and you'll be thinking, well, the DME is what we do in Unit 3, etc., etc. I want to try and unpick this morning with you what I think decision making is all about, because I think it is so much bigger and so much more to it than an examination paper. And I said last year when I was talking about fieldwork, that if we're going to assess fieldwork differently as we face the prospect in 2018 with the new GCSE examinations, we need first of all to work out what it is we're assessing. Well, I'm going to try and do the same thing today with DMEs. If we're going to have decision-making exercises, I think we've got to work out what is it about those that we want. Because if you choose a specification with a decision-making exercise, are you doing so instinctively? Are you doing so because it feels the right thing? Or are you doing it mechanistically because it looks quite a straightforward sort of exercise to do? I want to just backtrack from that really, because decision-making exercises are now quite long in the tooth as a kind of way of assessing pupils. And I want to try and assess what it is, therefore, we're trying to assess. And I want to begin with what is often for many teachers the parts of specifications that they never look at. I'm not going to ask any of you to embarrass yourselves by saying to you how many of you have never read the assessment objectives of the GCSE that perhaps you're currently teaching. But they are the stuff traditionally that gets lodged well behind the content, which is where most teachers spend their time looking. But I have to say to you that I think you need to get your head around these new assessment objectives for the new specifications, simply because therein lies all kinds of messages, not just messages about the kind of examination paper you might get, but actually the messages that the specifications are sending you about the skills, the concepts, the ideas that you need to be teaching. And this time it's really important. So I'm going to spend quite a bit of time looking first of all at this beast, just for a simple sort of acronym AO3, Assessment Objective 3. We'll look at that first of all for the new GCSEs. And if you're an A-level teacher, you might want to be thinking about AO2, as it's going to be in the new AS A-level, because they're all about the same thing. They're all basically about application. And sometimes teachers say, well, I'm never quite sure, and my students are never quite sure what a decision-making exercise involves. The most common question I get asked by students, for instance, is, how on earth do you revise for it? Because there's not apparently a body of content that you can get to grips with. Well, I think there are some things, and I think it's really the teachers have to kind of lay out the map ahead for the students in order perhaps to try to address the answer to that question. So I'll spend some time looking on that, and I want to try and unpick towards the end of this lecture, a few ideas about what sorts of things can we do to help students analyse, evaluate and make judgments, because that's fundamentally what the new AO3 is about at GCSE. And I think if we're going to do that, and if we're going to take on board what these new GCSEs are about, I think we've got to think about then what are the wider implications for our teaching and learning. It's very easy to go in and say, right, well, I'm teaching rivers for the next few weeks. And you take the textbook to help you define what the spec is all about and the level, and you do all the other things in planning, but fundamentally you still keep hold of content. I think you're probably going to have to do a little bit more. If you're at the back there, don't feel embarrassed in any way about finding a seat. Just make yourselves at home and find a comfortable seat. So what I'm saying is there's this minimalist way, I think it is a minimalist way of looking at DMEs, just to say, look, it's an exam. And we do a DME exam because our students always get good results in it. Well, that may be true, and if it's true, hope it's true, good luck to you. But I think it's quite a reductionist way of looking at what decision-making is about. Because I think, for me, decision-making has always been fundamentally part of geographical inquiry. And it's an integral part of it. And I think that there's a world of difference at the moment. You can almost... In fact, one very well-known member of the GA, Margaret Roberts, who's published widely on inquiry, she's felt for a long time, and certainly as I go around schools, I can pick up, you begin to sense after a while what kind of teacher it is you're talking to. Some teachers really enjoy being an expert, enjoy guiding students through content, through teaching students understanding about, river processes. Simon Mayo, the Radio 2 DJ, credits us with being nationally, we ought to have an accreditation award for being the people that have taught the entire nation about Oxbow Lakes. Therein lies our kind of USP. Well, I think we've got a greater USP than that. But some of the more traditional specs have tended to shy away from inquiry, so that you'll hear teachers saying sometimes, well, we do the inquiry during the exam period after the exams in year 10. What they actually mean when they say that is that they're referring to the fieldwork for controlled assessment. That's their chunk of inquiry. I think inquiry is much more about that, and I think that whatever kind of geography teacher you are and the specs you like teaching, I think you're going to have to get to grips with the fact that these GCSEs are fundamentally different. And nonetheless, although all the awarding organisations are going to have to take account of this new AO3, it's surprising still, it's the usual suspects. It's the ones that have got decision-making at the moment that are going to carry on having decision-making as a means of assessing GCSE. It's EDUQAS B, which is the current WJEC B, it's EdExcel B, and it's OCR B. Now, interestingly, there's a new phrase coming into the AQA GCSE, which is about issues analysis. And that's a new thing for the AQA GCSE. And that's quite a new sort of strand. So even whereas I think now there's a kind of distinctive group of specs that have that sort of, if you like, USP, that unique selling point. All exam boards are going to have to get to grips with this decision-making and analytical and interpretive sort of process. And I think that if we really get to grips with what decision-making is about, I think we add to what I've called, Andy and I were debating this the other day about there is such a phrase as real-worldness. I don't know if there is, but for me, good decision-making has to be about real situations and be about situations that students could find themselves in, and about, if you like, honing up their expertise in particular situations. I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. For the moment, let's just have a look at this beast, this set of assessment objectives. These are the new assessment objectives. You'll be familiar with these. AO1, knowledge, locations, places, processes, etc. Knowledge recall. But look just how little knowledge recall there is in the new GCSEs. Look relatively as well at how relatively little there is demonstrates geographical understanding of concepts, etc., interrelationships between places. I often refer to this as what I call taught understanding. And it goes with AO1 quite well. So if you're, for instance, teaching students about the most commonly taught topic, which from my experience in reading exam answers has to be the Three Gorges Dam. I think every student, never mind Oxbow Lakes, I think everybody teaches about the Three Gorges Dam. Most students haven't been to the Three Gorges Dam, a few lucky souls have, but they don't really understand it. What they understand about it is what their teachers taught them, what they've seen in video clips and what they've seen in the textbook. It's learned understanding, if you like, and they get the picture. They can tell you about advantages and disadvantages. AO3 is different. It talks about applying their knowledge and understanding. So it's really saying to you, all right, well, look, based on your knowledge of Oxbow Lakes, if that's what you want to do, or based on your understanding and knowledge about the Three Gorges Dam, what if? Let's take a new situation. What about if you do it this way? What about if a dam were to be built here? And you take that understanding and you apply it. And look at the weighting there, 35%. And the key words to get a grip of, really, I think, for this new AO3 are the words interpret, analyse, evaluate, and this bit, and this is where the decision making comes in, to make judgments. And we're asking students now, effectively, 1/3, 35%, of all their assessment in GCSE geography is about that really tough process of applying what you know. Now, it can be tough. It can also surprise you. Students that you find sometimes struggling with mainstream concepts actually get themselves into a DME situation, DME examination, and they nail it. They do really well. They like the approach. They get the approach. So there are some students who really do get quite switched on in this particular way. And of course, when they do all those things, they're using, you can't divorce it from the new AO4, Assessment Objective 4, about geographical skills. But again, it's not just select, adapt, and use a variety of skills full stop, i.e. six-figure grid references or knowing how to do a pie chart and all those things that you see in controlled assessment. It's not just that, you have to take the sentence on. And techniques to investigate questions and issues. They've got to get hold of that. Well, how would you go about? What might be a suitable method for collecting information? Now, some of you might be thinking, well, this is straying into fieldwork. Yes, it is. But actually, if they're going to read unseen data, look at unseen photographs of places they've probably never studied before, they've got to use all their skills, their aptitudes to think, well, what if I went here, what would it be like? How would I get to grips with this particular issue in this particular place? And as well as applying what they know and understand, they're using all those skills that you've taught them. So I hope you'll see that's really the one to get hold of. And I think there are implications for teaching. I've explained that all I think quite fully, and I don't want to go much more beyond what I've said, because this is simply AO3 in more detail. But I will just focus here on this particular bit. This making judgments, and that's the bit I think that the current specifications that use decision making as a method of assessment, that's where they come into their own, because not many awarding organisations have taken on that let's make a judgment, what's best for this or what's best for that. Coming to decisions and conclusions here based on evidence. As is usually the case, I'm about to embark on a summer of moderation of controlled assessment. And I quite often see students who set a hypothesis because, rightly, the teachers guided them towards doing it. They've gone out and collected some evidence. The evidence hasn't shown them what their hypothesis hoped it would do. The evidence actually is completely reverse of what they hoped their hypothesis would do. They think they better not get it wrong because it'll displease the exam board. So they're going to say, well, my river data are all over the place, but rivers do get faster as they go downstream, honest. Because they think they ought to be telling you that, whereas in fact their velocity readings on the river are all over the place. So this thing about being based on evidence is really important in the decision-making process. So rather than, I use the word polemic. The world is full of polemic about opinions about the EU. Loads of people have got opinions about the EU, and if any of you sort of put yourself through punishment, as I do weekly, and watch Question Time on BBC, the thing that people are most saying about the EU is, I just don't know what the facts are. Intelligent people, degree-educated people are saying, I don't know what the facts are. So I think there's a wider purpose in this getting to grips with evidence that I think as teachers, I think we're doing our students a big service if we help them through that mire. Because the first stage in getting to know something actually is admitting, first of all, that maybe you don't know as much as perhaps you might want to. And I'll just refer, this is focusing mainly on the new GCSE specs, but I will just refer to the new assessment objectives of the new A-level, because if we look at AO2 here, you'll see the same kind of wording, apply knowledge and understanding in different contexts. See, there are those words again, analyse, interpret, evaluate key geographical information and issues. And when you get to A-level, you'll see that, again, knowledge and understanding this time is lumped together as one assessment objective, but see, whereas we had 40% at GCSE, A-level it's only just over a third, 34.5% of the marks. So that means to say 65.5% of the marks are in these two, are in AO2, applying knowledge and understanding, and AO3, using a variety of relevant quantitative, qualitative and fieldwork skills. And you can see the balance there. Now, again, as an aside, if your students if you have got sixth form students and you're teaching A-level, you'll be dealing with the non-examined assessment, what we call the independent investigation, about which there's a workshop this afternoon. And that's going to absorb a reasonable number of these 28.5%. I think in most cases it'll be about 12.5%. So nearly half of those marks are going on one component. It means to say that this AO, this application, is becoming even more important in the other examinations. So those of you who've perhaps heard about a step up in demand for GCSE, a bit of a step up in demand for A-level, that's where the demand is. It's definitely in that application. So about decision making, why do we do it? What's its significance? Well, forgive me, there'll be a few of you in the room who were teaching in 1987, but not very many of you, and I suspect there were quite a large number of you who weren't even born in 1987. So forgive me, I was teaching in 1987, but one of the, well, there were two people, in fact, who particularly influenced the way that I thought. One was Mick Naish, who was a geography educator and was responsible for framing together what became known as 16 to 19 geography, but the other person was this, Ron Johnston. And Ron Johnston he wasn't kind of spearheading a revolt, he was just one of those people who made things clearer to me. When I read what Ron Johnston was saying, I could understand the words he was saying. And he, a bit instinctively like me, was having a bit of a thing against the positivist revolution. And the positivist revolution that took place in the late 60s and 70s in geography was basically where we got our wellies on. We didn't learn any more just from textbooks about what rivers did and take it on, if you like, on trust, as what the textbook author said. We got our wellies on and we went out and measured. And anything that could be measured, trust me, in the 70s, it was measured. And that's gone on. I mean, look where controlled assessment has got us. It's still there. There's that sense of, if you're going to do something, you better get your wellies on or better get your questionnaires on, because we need data. It was the decade or 15-year period of hard data. Now, Ron Johnston had a problem with that because in many ways, people were simply saying at the time, we need scientific methods to kind of, if you like, nail down this vague subject that we call geography. And Ron Johnston was saying, no, we don't actually. Well, we need data, but we need to be aware of something. And the phrase that he used was this. He talked about humanistic approaches to geography, or if you like, the paradigm of the subject. We are all different. We've all got our interpretations of whether the EU is a good thing. And some of you may have made up your mind which way you're going to vote on the 23rd of June, and others of you may think, I'm really not sure. Because we've all got our own lives, our own meanings, and our own interpretation of that through geography came from the 1980s and the humanistic revolution, the humanistic paradigm. Therefore, there's an implication for us as geography teachers. If personal meanings are important, if hard data is not what it's all about entirely, in its entirety, if we need to go further, then how do we do that with students? How do we help them to understand geographical concepts and processes that may be very, very different for different people? I remember Doreen Massey, whose name is going to come up a lot, and rightly so, in today and tomorrow in this conference, saying in her keynote in 2010 that she could understand the buzz about creating spaces like Canary Wharf in London's Docklands and London's position in the global economy. But what about the woman waiting for the bus in Harlesden, the bus that never came along, or the bus that was too long? And what about the fact that she got her pushchair and she couldn't get her pushchair onto the bus and had to wait in the rain? Because that was her real life. And her real life was no less than a life of somebody who was a financier in Canary Wharf. But we only tended to talk about the financiers in Canary Wharf as though they were more important. And I think we have to get to grips with different people's experiences and what meanings they ascribe to their lives, to the issues that they see, the questions that they've got. And Ron Johnson goes on, he says, knowledge is gained through experience, and this experience must be firmly established as verifiable evidence. That means to say, if you have an opinion about the EU and why it might be a bad thing, I can't put you down if I'm a supporter of that, because you've got your perspective. I can exchange views with you, I can exchange data and my interpretation, but I've nonetheless got to understand where you're coming from, your perspective. Now, we actually begin to do that a lot more in geography, in some of the more humanistic courses. And EDUQAS B has always been one of the courses that's badged itself in that way, that it matters when we teach students about understanding, who's in favour of the Three Gorges Dam or who's against the Three Gorges Dam. And it's got quite rooted into our teaching. And so the way we do that is to try and, the phrase I use, it's Margaret Roberts' phrase, and Margaret makes a big thing out of students making sense. That, if we're going to help students understand geography, we can't just present it to them as a kind of list of unrelated facts and concepts that mean nothing to them. We've got to help students engage with it in a way that gets them to make sense. And other people's sense, therefore, and other people's views, other people's standpoints, is one of the ways in which we help students understand their own sense. So what I'm saying is decision-making and the process of decision-making is about so much more than data. It's about taking on really a kind of what in the 1980s was quite a new approach, to take people's personal philosophies, and their outlooks on lives, and that would be our part of our personal philosophy as teachers, that we would engage with people's different views about the way in which they saw the world, or about in understanding particular issues. So again, I come back to this, it's so much more than a separate examination. And when I'll finish with the 1980s in a minute, honestly, but I think it's important to understand where we come from on this. I think that where we're going with this is that values are an essential component of geography. And that word values, if you try and do a search for values in the subject criteria, the content criteria for GCSE and for A-level, you really won't find it there very much, if at all. And part of it because, Ken Clarke, who's now revered as a senior member of the Tory party, used to talk about, those geographers, they're just concerned. It's the subject of concern, he said. As though, well, look, he once called us tree huggers. Yeah. Well, that was a put down. I don't regard tree hugging as a put down. I just think it's someone else, it's who they are. But this comes from a specification it was revolutionary at its time, the provision of the opportunity to consider the significance of values in environmental decision making, and for students to clarify, and here's the rub, develop their own values. By learning about what someone else thinks, actually I clarify what I think. And there's its purpose. So we're taking students not just along a line that says, well, look, there's a proposed dam here, what do you reckon? Okay, there's a few advantages, there's a few disadvantages, what do you reckon? Yeah, well, it looks like the advantages outweigh the disadvantages. You can do it in a very distanced way. But I think if you're really going to get to grips with decision making, that concern for values education has to lie at the heart of what we do. So, what are our principles? How do we get from that to, if you like, good decision making? Well, I think there are a number of rules, and I think most of the good decision-making exercises that I can think of, that I've seen, really have these things. There's a people environment, there's always an issue or a contested situation, something that's got difference at its heart. There is also, because at GCSE we're talking about 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds, and because at A-level, we're talking about relatively inexperienced in terms of the academic ways of the world, 17-year-olds, we need to give structure. That's one of our jobs as geographers. We provide structure from a question through a range of data and analysis to conclusion. So you can see there's that word analysis straight away. It's an early requirement. I think number 3 is one of my big bears, real big bugbears, real situations. I've always had a problem if I open up any kind of geographical resource and I see a cartoon there. Where shall we put the bypass in a fictional village? But what about, how are you going to get the range of opinions and advantages and disadvantages? Well, you're going to depend on stereotypes. And I think if geography teachers start dealing in stereotypes in a subject that is as real-worldly as any subject I can think of, I think we take ourselves down a very contested route. When you start drawing people in a suburb of a town, out comes the artist, they try and do, you see some textbooks from the 80s and the 90s where the artist has deliberately tried to use different tints of skin colour to make sure everybody's represented. It's awful, just awful. I think also we have to have real processes, a real understanding of how decisions are likely to be made. There's the new word that crops up in certainly 2 of the specifications, in fact 3, I'm already thinking of 3 and I haven't seen the 4th. 3 of the A-level specifications, it's the word players. And only 1 A-level specification makes detailed use of the word players at the moment in the legacy specs that you're currently teaching. But 3 of them certainly do, and I'm guessing probably a 4th will have to. That word players, who makes decisions and on what basis do they make decisions? I think students have to understand, who players, movers, shakers are, and what values are they coming to a situation with. I think we have to have data. Without data, we go back to polemic, we go back to opinion. We have to have data. So that's essential. I think we have to really let geography lie at the core. Now, I don't know if you ever put yourselves on the spot in the way in which I used to. I used to challenge my students of any age just to sort of say, look, geography is about anything. Keep on coming to me with ideas in lessons. Just throw me, tell me something that geography is not about. Well, I can bull for Britain if I want to. I'm managed to persuade. If it's a kind of 50 or 60 something mind versus a teenager, sometimes you can manage to pull one out of the hat. But geography is pretty well about anything. That should, if you like, in a way, that should be the least problematic, but it is one of the most important. If you want a real situation to come alive, you need to have real data and real impact and real solutions. There's one GCSE from the last legacy, the GCSEs that ended in 2009, which would always have, there'd always be three solutions given to students in the exam, and one of them, nobody in their right mind would go for it. Unless you were a completely mad, polluting, chemical-producing, if you really wanted to sort of, it's almost like somebody tipping a bag of fertilizer and pesticide into a river and just saying, hey guys, what do you think? Is that the right solution? Well, that was the geographical, if you like, the no-brainer. I think we have to have solutions that stand up, that are real, and which students can access. And I think this is the key thing. What we're actually doing is we're teaching, through a short exercise, we're teaching our students to think like an expert might think. Now, they're not an expert, of course they're not, but we're putting before them the information that experts have created, have given, and we're trying to take them down that route and saying, look, get to grips with a situation. Because for goodness sake, the newspapers won't do it for them, or most of them won't. I'm a Guardian reader, you can tell. So there are some of the requirements. And it's just a shopping list, really, but you need a variety of sources. You need a range of reactions. Don't try and limit the reactions. You need statistical and cartographic data. You need photos. I think you need photos for a sense of place. If you're going to have real places, let students into that place so they can begin to understand a little bit about either its complexity or its beauty, or it's a settlement on a main road, or it's a quiet suburb, it's a noisy suburb, whatever kind of place you're trying to show. And I'm willing to bet this one as well. If you start with a local issue, you very quickly, as a geography teacher, begin to see global applications. You begin to see much wider significance. So I think that wider significance is important as well as these contrasting values positions. Some of you will know I do various bits of writing for textbooks and so on. And I have to say, I got myself into quite a sort of situation I was writing about Cornwall, because it's where I live. Geographers like to write about places where they live. And I was trying to get students to grips with with the concept of players, about rural development. And I thought, okay, just to get this home, I'll throw in a conflict matrix. And the copy editor came in and he said, but I can only see people who are in favour. He said, it's not a conflict matrix. And I thought, yeah, actually, that's true. And so I had to kind of quickly delve a bit deeper. Not fictionalise, but start looking more deeply. So, it challenged me to do that. And it was my issue on my patch in my local town, and I don't teach anymore. So you can argue sitting there, if you're a busy teacher, you can say, well, he's got the time to do it. He ought to be able to do it. But it gets you into that situation sometimes where you have to think, well, there's got to be some sort of contrasting values position if it's an issue that's going to become alive. Otherwise, it's not really an issue. Okay, so how do we get to grips with designing these things? Well, I think I've mentioned those things. We need the issue, we need a proposal for change, a locational context, etc. Okay, that's quite a long shopping list. That personal context, real quotes by real people and organisations. There's a series of stages, if you like, and you can look at it. Most good decision-making examinations, or most good exercises in textbooks, and most textbook authors come up with these now. And it's a kind of series of stages. You go from stage 1 to stage 2. To stage 3, that's something that most students really do very well. See it in classes, I see it in fieldwork, I see it in examinations when I'm marking decision-making exercises. They get this idea of who gains, who loses very, very well. What they can't often do, they actually struggle with this bit sometimes about using evidence to reach a decision. That's the bit that really kind of stubs them in the toe, if you like. Either that, or you do occasionally get the student, and I'll quickly sort of share a story with you from about 2010, when this wasn't for EDUQAS, this was for another awarding body, when in another life I was principal examiner for a while for one of the other awarding bodies, and we had a decision-making exercise about Australia. And it was about the conflict between population growth and environmental degradation, if you like. And there were 4 situations that students were given. It was a pre-release booklet, so they had time to really engage with this. The 4 options were: let population grow rapidly, despite environmental degradation; slow it down and accept a degree of environmental degradation; actually reduce population slowly in order to restore some of the environment, or reduce it rapidly in order to let the environment recover. And I've never forgotten this one student this was a foundation tier student, and I bet he was a right pain. And that's why he got put in for the examination, because he started his answer, and I've still got a photocopy of it at home. He said, whichever way Australia turns, it's screwed. And he then went through all 4 solutions, proposals, and about none of these were ever going to be happy solutions for Australia. Whichever way it went, it was screwed. And I've never read a better decision-making answer before or since. It was easily the best one, and to me, that student should have been in higher tier. Now, actually, I say that as an aside, because I think some of the untiered papers might give you a few surprises, pleasant surprises. You might see which students can really think on their feet like that. But I use that just as a way of saying we can't always work out with the students in front of us how well they're able to make a decision, and particularly in the concentrated time of as an examination. But it is important, go back to this, it is important to get that sequence. And sometimes, if that hasn't quite made sense, do you backtrack to find out why it hasn't? Is it something about that way that student's thinking, or the way they've understood the issue? But busy teachers, how do you do that? Because that's one big ask. If you're trying to combine all those stages and devise your own DMEs, you're in for a hard time. So I think this is probably the trouble. This is why I think students see decision making as a bit of a bolt-on sometimes. Oh, it's the DME paper. I don't know how to revise, therefore I won't know how to revise, and I won't revise for it. You don't have to. I think sometimes they see these things as special events. And that's what I'm trying to kind of get away from, really. I'm trying to say, actually, if we permeate all of our teaching with those skills that are involved in good decision making, then I think over 2 years, or you might even be a 3-year GCSE geography teacher now, because many are, you might get them to it almost without knowing. And they might actually begin to think, yeah, the decision-making exercise, yeah, I can see what I'm going to have to do. It's going to start with an issue, it'll take me through some data, and I'll have to make a decision, because they'll be familiar with the approach. But where do you go as a teacher for examples, and other than past exam papers? You get some short examples, you get some mock examples in the endorsed textbooks. What I'm saying to you is this: I think the thing to do is actually just to build up, identify the processes of decision making and build them into your teaching in snapshots. So I've just got a few little sort of things like you could use as lesson openers or main activities, use of photographs or data, and a lot of these are actually about generating questions. So the first one, this comes from some training that Andy's been doing with EDUQAS. And it just takes a photograph from Nairobi. And I've just thrown some questions. Now, these are questions, and I know Andy's quite happy and very comfortable with pushing this kind of activity with teachers when doing training for WJEC and EDUQAS. But using photographs to identify questions brings alive the issues of living there. There is the simple question. There's always the kind of, who owns the land? Where is this? Who lives here? Kind of thing. But look at questions like this. Isn't it dangerous near the railway? Or essentially, could people change this place if they wanted to? I pinched that one. That came from a decision-making exercise that I'd run with students in my last school. I have a thing I call my personal archive. My partner calls it a mess. It's called my study. But I keep things. I've got things from when I was teaching and bits of paper like that. And I keep little sort of snapshots of things that students have done. And that was one of them. That was one of the questions a student of mine came up with about 10 years ago. It still remains a good question. Could people change this place if they wanted to? Which asks about power and space. So you can use that, and that takes you straight into the thought process of thinking, well, what's the issue about this place? And how might different people see that place and that space in different ways? So there's that. You can do the same activity with data. This again is one of Andy's resources from some EDUQAS training for teachers. And I think there are loads of questions you can ask about, who gets this percentage of a bag of coffee beans, in terms of its value, who gets the allocation of where the worth of that goes, who gets what? That's been a familiar question to geography teachers for a long time. Students will ask you questions. 25% goes to the grower. Well, does that mean the workers on the coffee estates, or does that mean the plantation owner? Who does that mean? So you can start building further about these questions. How do supermarket workers feel about this? If 25% goes to the retailer, are they getting that 25%? Well, of course not. Because the Tesco share price or the Sainsbury's share price depends on them, them being held back as much as they can. We begin to see things, and you start asking questions: should shares be allocated in this way? You start asking questions that are values based. That should, ought, that sort of thing. So using data like that, and when you're getting real people's quotes, I came across, I don't know if any of you have ever been to the Docklands Museum in East London, in Canary Wharf. It's a great place. They get a lot of local schools and local adult groups going around the museum there. And a few years ago, they'd had just a big board where they got people to put up post-it notes about what have changes in East London meant to you. And that was what the exhibition is all about. They've got this fabulous display of 80s Docklands, 90s Docklands, 21st century Docklands, London as a big financial centre and world city. And these were some of the things that people came up with. There were 3 quotes here are fabulous. Essex is now the home of the East End, as all the original East End people have moved out. Romford Market is now where you'll find the East End people, not Newham or Tower Hamlets. So i.e. the places where most change is taken from. It's almost as though there's been that process of kind of out-migration, of pushing away somebody else. Born and bred in the East End, popular in the Isle of Dogs, moved away, but like a magnet, it keeps drawing me back. Unfortunately, I just can't afford to move back here. So there's that kind of human experience, somewhere that somebody would love to live in. You can use real quotes. You can get students identifying their own place, what's going on in their own place and how they feel about their own place. That will come to you in a big way when you look at the Changing Places units that are written by the different awarding bodies for the Changing Places topic in the new A-levels from this September. And then this other one, and this begs a question about change. My great-grandmother came from Bethnal Green and moved from working in London to Tilbury Docks. I think it's a good thing their East End has gone. It was unremitting poverty. If you do watch Call the Midwife, you'll know what that unremitting poverty was about. But that change in the East End, change is a fundamental part of what we teach. So sometimes we come across sources of what people write. And these days there are lots of blogs online and things like that, and you can get students looking at viewpoints like that. Well, just in the last few minutes, let's just look at the sort of things that we do as geographers to help them improve their decision-making skills. This is probably about the simplest piece of guidance that you can ever get to students, because generally, by the time students come to the end of a GCSE course, they know economic, social, environmental in terms of impacts or in terms of processes. They're really aware of that. So that's a slide that actually I put together really for a revision conference for students. But I think it's a good series of hooks. I'm saying it's good because I put it together, but actually it came from a number of different sources. Chief examiners tend to give quite a lot away in their reports that they write every year, and those are the things that they say. Those are the things that, if you look through teaching geography, number of articles about decision making and the processes involved. Those are the things that students can mention. You've got things like big concepts like sustainable development. Almost everything now, I think we've moved beyond the stage now that we were in probably about 10 years ago, thinking about, well, how do we make sustainable development make sense to students? I think we've really helped it to make sense in a big way. And I think that sustainable development has become a big hook, or a series of big hooks, for helping to analyse proposals. And I think that there are a number of models to help us with that. And one of those is the sustainability stool. Well, that just goes back to economic, social, environmental. Some of you may use that. There is also the quadrant, the sustainability quadrant, which looks at issues to do with equity and futurity and environment. And something we often ignore in geography, public participation. Concepts such as bottom-up, or questions: does it benefit everybody? Will it last? And then some of you will have the egg and wheel at your disposal. If you use Eggen's wheel for sustainability, those are three ways in which we can conceptualise sustainability. Not just conceptualising, but it almost gives students the one thing they really crave sometimes, which is a bit of a checklist. If they've got stuff buzzing around their heads, a bit like the EU, with many of us, what you really want sometimes is not someone to tell you the answers. You want someone to kind of say, look, these are the things you might consider. So you look at the Eggen's wheel and you decide to go routinely around that and think, okay, well, it's really strong in that way, or it's not strong in that particular way. Or you might just simply say, well, it's a very strong economic argument, but I'm not convinced about the environmental argument. So those are all really helpful. And I think, and again, I have no ownership of this. This is a slide which, again, Andy has put together for some training for EDUQAS teachers. These to me are the foundations of what AO3, that assessment objective, is really all about. That instead of thinking about learning facts related to case studies, I'm moving away from liking the idea of case studies. I like kind of examples, really, and place examples, rather than just students chunking case study. And they end up with, Margaret Roberts, I remember a long time ago, did analysis of students' work from a couple of specifications. She thought the students had this kind of polka dot view of the world. They either saw huge patterns that they couldn't get to grips with, couldn't really fully understand, or they just understood these little places. They knew that there was the Masai Mara in Kenya, and they knew about tourism there, but they couldn't apply it to anywhere else. That was what they knew about. So less concern with that and more concern on these, and here are those words again: interpretation, analysis, appraisal, making decisions, justification. Those are the kinds of questions that might permeate our classrooms. So which is the best option, and justify your decision? That comes straight off exam papers, and students will need to get to grips with that. But these things like, to what extent do you agree, are really a evaluative question. It's not actually a hard question, but it begins to prepare students for that command word evaluate that they'll meet in examinations from 2018. So those are the kind of, if you like, they're the interesting, they're the challenging questions, and I don't think we should back off having those challenging and interesting questions in our lessons. I think that's what brings geography really, really alive. So those are the things. Finally, there's the conclusion. What do we want from our students for decision-making skills? Well, I think range. I think we want advantages, disadvantages, but we do want evidence. That cell there, I think, if anything is going to characterise good decision making as much as anything, we have to have the quality evidence to show that this is an issue that's worth getting to grips with. And by evidence, I mean hard and soft. It can be data. It can equally be people's opinions. And you know, if you've grown up with hard data, soften your approach, soften your thinking a little bit to include things like people's quotes, interviews, and so on. You get a tremendous amount from people about changes in places, both at this level and at GCSE level and at A level. So those are the things I think that once we've got the evidence, then I think the rest of it kind of follows. That, you know, we can begin to help students develop not just an argument but a counter argument. If I'm going for this, I understand I'm going for this because I see the weaknesses in the opposite arguments, and therefore they can then make that final decision. Okay, so there we are. And finally, well, I started with I mentioned Mick Nash and Ron Johnson. I think this is just so important now. It might be a quote from, you know, the best part of 30 years ago. It probably is 30 years ago. If it was a book published in 87, it's probably being written in 86. Here's the bit. In this sense, one of the aims of inquiry-based learning in geography is to help to develop political literacy. Small p, political literacy. Knowledge. You go into that voting booth, if you want to kind of have its kind of penultimate expression, you know, about making a decision. Or you read a newspaper, or you watch something on TV. You look at the way in which graphs are presented, and you see, hang on, they've only started the base of the vertical scale is 400, and they're trying to show me that, you know, there's a really, things haven't gone up very much. If they started at 0, it would be a very different sort of graph. That kind of thing, that political literacy. And then again, you know, as I said, Doreen Massey, only if we conceive of the future as open. You know, can we seriously accept or engage in any genuine notion of politics, not closed down? And that's what geography teaches, what I think we're all about, is open up the issues and let's really engage students with, you know, questions, with data, and with making informed decisions. Okay, any questions from you? I know Andy wants to say a little bit. I've probably gone a minute over. I think I've gone 2 minutes over. Sorry about it. Is it actually, what was I due to finish at? 25 to. My God, I finished early. No, thank you very much. Thanks for coming along, everyone. Thank you.